Bootstrap provides a grid system that makes it easy to build responsive page layouts. In this video, we'll go over how to use it. At the lowest level of your grids, you'll find containers. Containers are your most basic element in Bootstrap that you need to actually start building that grid. They're used to contain, pad, and center the contents within your grid. They provide the simplicity and predictability of fixed layouts, but with a responsive twist. It's worth noting, however, that your containers should never be nested. Bootstrap comes with three kind of different types of containers. First of all, there's the container class. The container class itself sets its max width differently at each responsive breakpoint. Container fluid is set to always be 100% at all breakpoints. And then there's a few more classes based on a particular breakpoint. You can say at this point, it should be 100% width until you get to this point, and then it should be less than 100%. So we can look at this table and we kind of see how these work out. So container, normal container, is one you're going to use most of the time, is going to say at small devices, it's 100% of the width. Okay, or extra small devices, it's at 100%. And then we get to extra small, it'll bump up, it just jumps up to 540. So it's responsive, it's exactly the full width of the viewport up until you get to 576 pixels or wider. And at that point, it jumps to being exactly 540 and stays 540 until you get to 768, right? So your traditional way of doing a fluid layout, you might say, at this point, well, it starts out 100%, and then it's just 80 or 90% from there on. But this provides the kind of fixed behavior that has a certain pixel measurement up until a certain point where it breaks and gets bigger. So it's 540 for this whole period in between, for all the small devices, and then exactly 720, and then exactly 960, and then exactly 1140. And this puts it roughly at 90–80% of the width of the viewport on average. But it has that behavior that you don't have all these different pixel measurements in between that you have to test for. You only have these specific breakpoints, these specific buckets that you have to deal with. So that can make it a lot easier to design layouts rather than having designed for that full range. You only design for those specific breakpoints. Next up, you've got container small. And I think at least container small is the same way actually as container. It breaks and becomes it becomes fixed at small. Medium then goes up from there. Medium starts to behave. Starts at small, it's 100% instead of the regular container being 540. It actually starts 720. So the fixed, if you have these suffixes, basically it starts becoming fixed later. Up until you get to container fluid. At container fluid, it's always 100%, right? Now, the problem with using container fluid is that once you put that in there, you're saying, well, I'm going to test all of the things in between. I'm going to test the very small sizes. I'm going to test every little pixel measurement in there and make sure that it works. So this is kind of the traditional way of doing fluid layouts. But it has some issues because just the number of test cases and screen sizes that you have to test for. So that's the advantage of using container over using container fluid, is you have to test fewer cases. Okay, so oftentimes what I'll do is I'll kind of, if I do want the page, if I do want my content not to take up, most of the time containers are a great thing to do, and you might do it on the outside. Sometimes you want a lot of things on your website to stretch all the way to the edge of the viewport. At that point, one thing you can do, rather than going all the way up to saying, well, let's just use container fluid because I want it to stretch to the full width of the screen, you can start the container fluid not at the root, not right after your body, but maybe further in. Nested further in, you start your container, and that way you can have it like, hey, I can still give this thing on the outside of background, this section of background, but then have my container inside of my section. So the Bootstrap Grid System is based on a 12-column system. It uses a combination of containers, rows, and columns to lay out and align the content. It's also built on top of Flexbox, where your rows are Flexbox containers. It is worth noting that the rows are also set to Flex Wrap is enabled. So if you have more than 12 columns worth of space on a row, it will actually wrap and become part of the next row. So the nice thing with 12 is it divides evenly in a lot of convenient ways. So because 12 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12, all of those numbers, it makes it easy to subdivide it in several different ways. So for instance, if I say I want this thing to span the full width, then I'll give it a width. The full viewport, I can give it a width of 12 columns. If I only want it to span half of the screen, I can give it a width of 6 columns. If I want it to span a third of the screen, I can give it a width of 4. And you can come up with these numbers. You just say, well, 4 times 3 is 12. If I want to divide it into 4, right? So here I've got 3 columns. Okay, so 3 column width gives me 4 items. If I make each thing, I make it 2 columns wide, then I can get 6 things on that same row. And if I make it 1 column wide, then I can get 12 things on that row. Now, I would say be very wary of ever making things 1 column wide. 1 column is usually not wide enough to fit hardly anything. One column is very narrow, even on large devices. 1 column is still very narrow. So usually you want to set things as 2 columns or larger. Okay, so you can use these different layers because of the 12-column system. You can use it in all of these different ways, which is part of what makes it really convenient to use that system. So let's say I want to build a very simple sort of layout, and this one's going to be fixed. So let's say I want to build a simple layout where I've got a sidebar and the main content, and that sidebar takes up 2/3 of the width. Okay, so I can implement that with these ideas that we've already talked about, the container, the row, and the column. So on the outside, I'll say that I have my container, okay, and then inside of there I have a row, and that row contains 2 items. So I've got column 1, which has a class of column 4, and then column 8. So column 4, remember, that's about a third. Column 4 is a third of 12. And then column 8 is 2/3 of 12. So that means 4 and 8 together, we get 12. Right, so that's going to be 1/3 and 2/3. So that gets me that standard sort of fluid layout for my sidebar and things like that. So I can get it that way. If I want to switch the order of those, we just switch the order of those 2 in the HTML. Or using Flexbox otherwise. So the breakpoints, just to remind you, we did talk about this in the previous video, but remember that the breakpoints for extra small, which is defined by default, is 0 or bigger. Small, which is SM, is 576 or bigger. Medium is 768 or bigger. Large is 992 or bigger. And extra large is 1200 or bigger. Okay. So given that, we can also use those classes. We first built a fixed layout, and if I specify those as like column 8 or column 4, I'm not specifying a breakpoint, so it will always be that number of columns wide. So if I don't specify a breakpoint, I'm not getting a responsive layout. In order to get a responsive layout, I do need to specify at what breakpoint does it become that. So here I'm specifying that each of these three columns is column medium 4. So for medium or larger devices, they will take up, each of these will take up 4 columns, or a third of the screen width. But I haven't specified here necessarily, you'll notice I haven't specified how wide the columns are by default. And by default, if you don't specify one of the fixed ones that we saw earlier, like col 4 and col 8, by default it's actually column 12. So here, because it falls back to column 12, it falls back to 100% width. On mobile, this will actually be entirely vertical. It'll be each of these columns will be 100% width of the viewport. So by specifying this layout, I'm going to get on mobile devices, this will be all entirely vertical like this, but medium or larger, I get this sort of horizontal layout. So you can very quickly get responsive layouts using this technique a lot quicker than you can even do with, a lot quicker than you might do by setting all the flex stuff up yourself. Okay, so let's look at another example. Maybe I want it to take another step. So the first one we saw, I had 3 things and they were either vertical or horizontal. Well, maybe if I have more things, I have some more options. So here we're going to start on small devices. This is what I'm trying to achieve on small devices and extra small devices. We've got it all vertical. When we go to medium or larger, we're going to go to 3 columns. So you can see 1, 2, 3, and then it wraps and is the next one. And then on extra large devices, you see all 6 of the items are arranged in a single row. Okay, so you'll notice right now, if you look at the HTML for this, notice that all 6 of these things are in one row. A lot of new students make the mistake of putting all these things in separate rows. So they look at this and go, okay, well, I want it to be, I want it on this size in the middle, I want it to be 3 items per row. So I'll break this down into 2 separate rows, right? So I'll make a row here for the top 3 items and then another row for the bottom 3 items. Don't do that because you don't get very responsive layouts when you do that. It's actually better to take all these things and put them in one row. Remember that row is a flex container with flex wrap turned off. You actually get more responsive behavior if you put these all in one container. Because the problem is, as soon as I split them out into a row, if I say these 3 are in one row and these 3 are in another row, then I can't then go easily put those 2 rows next to each other. So it's actually better to throw all of these items into one row. So generally I would say don't think of the row as a row as it normally might suggest, as the name might suggest, but think of a row actually just as a flex container, and then just put all the things in there into the flex container. So we can see with this, I've said first, remember it's mobile responsive, so it's going to start out col 12, and then when we go up to medium or larger, it will be 4 columns wide. Each of these is 4 columns wide. 4 times 3 is 12. That's why we get 3 columns per row, 3 items per row. And then when we finally go up to extra large, you can see column extra large 2, they all go to a width of 2 columns. And so with putting those 2 classes on here, we get those 3 different versions of this layout very quickly. Okay. You can find a lot more examples about how to use the grid system at this page here. But that's the end of the video here. I'll see you again in the next video. All right, thank you for watching.